Good morning, everyone. My name is Jackie DeGarmo, and I'm so pleased that you have agreed to help us launch the inaugural symposium for our institute here at Walsh for the study of the intelligent community. The Intelligent Community Forum is a global think tank and foundation that studies ways to engage communities for the new century. Many of you have been with us from the beginning. Some of you are new this morning. Our institute helps to provide a resource for the movement regionally, connecting to 114 partner communities around the world, further advancing Walsh's commitment to global literacies and services, and provoking an exploration of new models for the preparation of educators for our knowledge economy. We are privileged to have with us today its co-founder and Walsh University graduate. Please recognize Mr. Lou Zaccarilla. Lou just joins us after having helped the Intelligent Community of the Year celebrate success. This year, that community happened to be in the United States, and last night, the champion of those efforts addressed us. Please recognize Steve Reniker, CIO, Riverside, California. Also here to offer their thought leadership and guidance are the following distinguished members of our International Board of Directors. I ask that you please hold your applause until they're all standing. Those with us this morning: Christian Long, Vice President, Canada Design; Dan Matheson, Mayor, Stratford, Ontario; Christina Werner, Director, Intelligent Communities at Waterfront, Toronto; Dr. Norm Jackness, Director, Cisco's IBSG Public Sector Group; Dr. Chil-Soo Park, Associate Professor, Department of U-City Design and Engineering, Sungkyun Kwan University, Suwon, South Korea; Shirley Fenton, Vice President Director, National Institutes of Health Informatics and Research, Associate, Computer Systems Group, University of Waterloo; and Alex Fosnot, who had to be in his lab this morning, Walsh University class of 2016. Thank you for being part of this whole enterprise. And we're all here this morning because local leaders saw that there was more that could be done and should be done to advance our community and our learners. Please welcome the president of Walsh University, Richard Saum.
Welcome to Walsh University, all of you, from near and far. When an event starts with the kind of music we started this morning, I get this primitive urge to yell out, "Let's rumble!" However, I know that would not be appropriate of a college president, so I take it back. However, we really do welcome you here, and we have a great realization that as we begin this whole movement that we're involved in, as we talk about reinventing our communities, as we talk about what we can do differently with teacher training to affect education and learning in our schools, there are multiple ideas, multiple opinions, and what we're only attempting to do is to share with you what is going on out there. We realize very often in any community, whether that community be a large city or a small organization, there's a hope that leadership will lead. I suggest to you that that is not only a hope, that's the best possible situation. However, we also, all of us know that many times vision comes from grassroots movements like this one, when people believe, when people are creative, and when people are innovative. Throughout this day, you'll get to meet people all assembled here in North Canton on an early morning to share with you their vision, their insights, their stories. We hope that every single one of you, before the day is over, will walk out with a few takeaways of what might be, what you might try, what experiment would be worth your time, and what energy you can take out of the room with you, and wherever you're going, this afternoon, this evening, or tomorrow, you're able to do it with at least some level of renewed energy. The Walsh campus is beautiful on this midsummer day. We hope you enjoy it. You're welcome to roam during lunch or at any other breaks. Feel free to walk around the campus. Don't pick the flowers, but other than that, have at it and enjoy. I would be remiss if we didn't take just one moment to recognize the chair of the board of the Herbert Hoover Foundation, Lacey Hoover, who is here somewhere. There she is. Would you stand, please? The Herbert Hoover Foundation funded this whole event. If it were not for her vision and the vision of the foundation to support and help us start something. Lots of people want to support lots of things once they're successful. The visionaries support them while they're in those early stages. And Lacey, we thank you for that. So you didn't come here to hear me. I'm going to get out of here. Wish you a wonderful day on the Walsh campus and hope you leave with renewed energy. Thank you.
Okay, let's get started. Here are the people who are going to be helping us today. First of all, Dr. Rick Miller. He's had a career focused on being school reform and improved student achievement in diverse settings. He's co-founded a collaborative assistance program for teachers and administrators and concentrated his organizational efforts on building more collaborative structures within our school organizations. He's co-founder of the Mountain West Superintendent's Roundtable, a regional superintendent think tank, and he's also one of the founders of a California school reform group that's currently proposed school reform initiative on the November 12th general election ballot. He came to us today also, of course, from Riverside, California, and our weather for the first time is better. So thank you. Okay. Also with us this morning, Logan Smalley, director of TED Ed, TED Fellow, and also documentarian for his film Darius Goes West. Former teacher, aspiring musical saw player, as in wood saw, and lifelong learner, and he prefers to be learning every minute of the day, he tells us. Strong supporter of the TED community, which he calls his primary source of ideas and inspiration as they continue to build out the TED Ed initiative, which is in its beta form. He is the perfect choice for our inaugural event, as he calls himself a global soul. And finally, leading us today, Christian Long, who leads the educational efforts at Canon Design while promoting The Third Teacher, a book and platform that presents their research and findings into the importance of design in education. That particular book is being used by a faculty learning community that's been organized by our provost here on campus, and we're very excited to have him kind of in residence. Prior, he was the founder of Be Playful Design, a collaborative global consulting team focused on the intersection between school design, emerging technology, and learning theory. You'll soon understand why he is recognized as a gifted educator and consultant. Together with Canon Design and Bowen and Associates, he's helped Walsh University design a dynamic new center for interdisciplinary solutions-driven work, a community resource center for entrepreneurial idea generation, and it will also be a center for global connectivity, as well as a base for our initiatives and our institute's outreach. Now it is in its schematic design phase. Thank you, Christian, and take us away. Have a great morning.
Good morning. Before we get started, has everybody at every table had a chance to just meet the folks that you've been blessed to sit with? Some of you came as teams. Some of you were sitting by folks for the first time. Has everybody met? Fair enough, fair enough. Why that's going to be important, besides the fact that when we are gifted with an opportunity to sit with people, we have a chance to move some version of the world together. Later on, in about an hour or so, once the three of us share examples from worlds that we're fortunate enough to be a part of and things that are catching our eye, we're going to ask you, you'll notice Post-it notes in front of you and Sharpies. Those aren't just props, they're meant to be put into motion. And in essence, we're going to ask you to take on a design challenge as a team. We know that ultimately being smart gets us to the table, trusting each other is what allows us to do something of importance. So to a degree, once we get through these initial sort of discussion points and the PowerPoint goes away, ultimately we're going to ask you to take on a question that doesn't have an obvious answer. And within 30 minutes or so, can we pitch something that will be unforgettable? And that's the most important part of the time we have together. So we appreciate your patience as the three of us share some of what inspires us. And all of us are parts of teams that pull off extraordinary things. We are not the individuals that have done so. How it's going to go in order, I'm going to sort of prime the pump with, as the PowerPoint says, a bias and a thesis. I'm a big believer that our resumes and CVs are what we've been conditioned to share, but ultimately it's our biases that allow us to be active. They're the things that keep us up at night, the reasons that we work harder despite constraints, and the reason that we believe things are possible despite the fact they've never been done. A thesis allows us to posit, whether it be a hypothesis or a premise, but something that says this is possible. So to a degree, I want to start with that. Last night at dinner, sitting somewhere on this side of the room, I sat with a wonderful group of people, but immediately on both left and right, Doug, who as president oversees the North Canton Area Chamber of Commerce, and then Joel, who's the founder of an organization called Tom Todd, right? Tomorrow, Today Ideas, Tom Todd Ideas, that's just getting ready to launch. And what's interesting about that, besides as human beings, they bring remarkable stories to that table and to a room like this, like everybody here. On one side of the table, we have somebody who has been charged and morally and professionally is responsible for ensuring that an entire business community remains fertile. It's an extraordinary responsibility and a wicked challenge. Next to him, or next to me, was a gentleman who is launching something for the first time that believes that middle school students, not only the most awkward young person in all of our lives, and in some respects, it's that person that still resides in each one of us. When we're under stress or we're deeply passionate about something, that middle school spirit often rises to the sort of the forefront. But Joel believes, through Tom Todd Ideas, that a young person at the most awkward stage is the best positioned to take on the wicked challenges ahead of them. More importantly, to be empowered to be a voice for the challenges that we should take. So what happens, not just at dinner, but what happens in a community when a person charged with overseeing the fertile, vibrant economic engine of a community? Probably oversee isn't what he would say. Doug would probably say he humbly serves those who are doing that hard work. Sitting next to somebody who believes that an 11-year-old in some state of awkwardness is the most well-positioned young person to take on the wicked challenges that don't have clear answers. What happens if we just get out of their way? What happens if that conversation becomes a default setting? Not educators, not business people, not wherever the 7th graders talk, and not the adults who sort of have their script set. But what happens when that collision becomes the default setting? And I think to a degree, this event isn't about a conference. We've all become expert at these kinds of situations. All of us know what to do. We come in, we know how to take down the notes, we know how to translate those, we know how to decide what's useful, and we know how to make connections and pass business cards out. Ultimately, the challenge is, can we create friction? Can we create honorable tensions that allow us to create the next. Rick is going to come up in a second and speak about, in one particular community, how Riverside took on that challenge within an educational sector. So in essence, how do you look at the future of education within a school district that represents a community, that represents a region, that represents the aspirations of all of us, and says, despite constraints, and despite that no one's done this, we're going forward. Logan is going to take on a similar challenge with a slightly different set of details, and that is, how do you start with a global platform and then work your way back to the most hyperlocal? How do you take advantage of a world of ideas and figure out a way to funnel that back to a person come Monday in their community, in their seat, with their team? So we're going to hear both of them talk about this, but I want to share a quick bias. One way or another, all of us benefited from this experience. All of us in this room are the winners of this arrangement. And often when a picture like this is shown in a context of the future of learning, there's a suggestion implied parenthetically and sometimes obnoxiously thrown out that this is no longer relevant. Whatever got you all here, whatever you represent, whatever you've honored, wonderful, thank you, but now it's time to get serious about the 21st century. And I think where it's an interesting tension, because to a degree, if you talk about the future of learning right now, what we really need to be talking about is why right now, at a moment where education is central to everything we do, is it possible that educators no longer believe that they have a voice of value in their communities? Why is it, for the first time in the history of modern America, everybody's invested in education, but at the expense of us going forward? These are incredible tensions. We could look back at a picture like this and say it's antiquated, it's cute, it's quaint. What happens after that is a sense that the system we have today is broken. One way or another, whether it's a headlines in the Wall Street Journal, whether or not it's a think tank, whether or not it's people arguing in the town square, there is a sense that the system is broken. I'm going to ask that we reposition that. I'm going to ask that we look at this picture in terms of what was the great aspiration and the great value that it provided. What's the foundation? If we go back to 1600s in Massachusetts, somebody had the audacious idea that we would educate young people. It's a pretty remarkable assumptions. It only affected 0.00000 something % of the population, but it was a baseline. We get into the early 1820s, and now we're getting closer and closer to ubiquitous education. In fact, it'll be illegal to not send your children to school. So during the founding of a country, we went from, we may not even exist in 2 or 3 decades, because the British did come back. They weren't done. We hadn't proven anything. We were a real upstart entrepreneurial outfit. And during that time where we had our most delicate fragile, without any proof of concept, without a business plan, without a spreadsheet, without any example around the world, without another case study to learn from, we said, universal education, universal literacy, go now, no exceptions. It's a pretty remarkable moonshot. And to a degree, it got us to this. And I'm going to suggest that the system isn't broken. I don't think any of us would be here today if we ultimately believe that, but it's hard to see the media suggesting that we're at this remarkable moment of education. But if we assume this, that what the past did in terms of education and why all of us are the beneficiaries and the winners of this system, literally the winners of this system, it allowed us to do a simple thing: make eye contact, get the hand directly into the hand, firm handshake, show up on time, do what's expected of us. And what the promise was that if we were responsible, the promise in return was we guarantee you a seat at the table, and we guarantee for the next several decades of your life, there's a guaranteed set of outcomes. Right? If you do what's asked of you, we promise to give you something in return. The challenge today isn't that the system is broken, it's there are no more guaranteed outcomes. It's not that the past isn't relevant, it's more relevant than ever. Wisdom counts more than ever. Responsibility matters more than ever. But when we talk about the 21st century of education, we're not talking about technology, because we're 5 years, 10 years, 20 years away from it being ubiquitous and sort of no longer the thing we talk about. So the real question is, once we get to ubiquity, which I think Riverside, you have taken on that grand challenge, and once we get to a global network where we have access to the great minds around the world in a blink of an eye, what are the questions we're going to ask at that moment? When we're not arguing about funding a one-to-one laptop program, where we're not arguing about whether or not this test score equals that aspiration, when we simply have access to infinite data and access to infinite aspiration, and we start to collaborate and take on the great challenges, what are the questions we're going to ask? I think we need to remind ourselves that the past of education got us here, but what it really did is it taught us to trust that if we did X, some extraordinary next was available. So when we look at the kids today, the sort of the young people, the digital natives, whatever sort of the things that our community to say, it looks a little bit messier. And I think probably every generation of elders saw that to be the case, even back in the day when everything was predictable. To a degree, what I'm going to posit here, and I'm curious about how Rick not necessarily will explicitly say, but sort of the soul of what he says, and same with Logan, is how do we create environments where it's not about responsibility, it's about the ability to respond when we don't know what next looks like. How do we position our young people to not just get into college, not just take a seat in your organization, not just have the skill sets that we can map exactly on the spreadsheet? How do we treat those young people as tackling the world's great challenges that none of us collectively have answers for yet, so that they have the ability to be agile just in time, take on multiple roles as leaders and as humble servants, to recreate themselves on a regular basis as a default setting, and to ultimately realize they're not going to get there on their own, and possibly even the idea of meritocracy, which is the great center, the great DNA of American education, is meritocracy. The problem is meritocracy doesn't say collaboration. Meritocracy says, I have the answer, and the great challenges ahead of us mean we have to struggle humbly with what are the questions we should be asking. So to a degree, I want to throw three things out there that are going to be asked as sort of questions, and then hand off to both Rick and Logan. I'm ultimately curious as an educator, as a designer, as a father of a class of 2025 and 2027 kiddo. I'm ultimately curious about, can we create schools not that allow us to be number one in the world, but allow our kids to be infinitely agile? How do we create learning environments that aren't just schools over here, but instead everywhere in a community is the act of learning at great speed? I'm interested in this idea of, can we create response-able, and that's where the word would have been if the screen kept going, response-able learning environments. And to a degree, it's not about us trying to create those schools, it's us being that response-able learning environment. How do we play a role in that? An asset map of learning, this is very, very quick, and I've been thinking a lot about ICF and about ultimately, what does ICF challenge us to do? I think ultimately, it teaches us to be both cartographers, people who create maps of cities and communities and neighborhoods, but also to see the assets that already exist. Maybe the ones that are sitting one person to the left, one person to the right, that typically wouldn't be in a dialogue about solving that problem. How does somebody overseeing a Chamber of Commerce sit down with somebody who's overseeing the launch of a non-for-profit for middle school kids and say, we collide? And what does it mean in multiple ways? One of the very first assignment I had when I shifted from being a classroom teacher to designing schools, it was about 12, 13 years ago. I was in Boston, and this, if you knew Boston well, you would know this was the most dangerous part of Boston to be a kid. This is Dorchester. 60% dropout rate before they graduate from high school. In the 70s, this community was literally burning down. This is white flight, the case study. This is where everybody gave up. This is pre-Detroit. Someone came along 15 years later and said, we have got to rebuild this community. And it didn't start with education, it started with health. And it didn't start with a hospital, it started with a healthcare attitude. How do we allow our community to be healthy, proactively healthy? And from that, how do we make all things possible? At a certain point in time, they built the capacity across the neighborhoods to not just repair broken bodies, but to reinforce the aspiration of to thrive. So they took on a great ICF challenge, so to speak, of how do you create a community that's thriving? When they got to education, what was interesting is there wasn't a place for this new charter school, Codman Academy, which I was asked to help design. There wasn't a place for it to go. There was no building that could host the school. And that easily could have been a deal killer. There was the constraint. There was the yeah, but. There was we can't do it. There was the sure, I see how they do it over there, but we can't do it here. There could have been a moment where this aspirational entrepreneur said, just not now. There are all kinds of reasons to wait until somebody else proves it's going to be done. And she shifted from how do we get the school, the solution? Let's look at the entire asset map. Instead of creating a gym, instead of trying to fund a gym, she said, what if I had kids walking across this community every day And now, years later, these kids walk 2 to 3 miles a day, every single day they're at school. At a time where the national trend is to get rid of gym class. Instead of building a theater, they partner with the Huntington Theater, one of the great theaters in Boston, and their kids don't just study Shakespeare one semester, they're on stage performing Shakespeare 2 days a week for an entire year. Again, these are kids who dropped out, 60% of them dropped out, many of them first generation to graduate from high school, let alone go to college, if they graduated. Many of these kids thought they would be dead by the time they were 18, not struggling with which college to go to. I'm interested in that as a premise. How do we look, whether it be North Canton or all the communities we represent, how do we look at the asset map of possibility? PISA scores, how many familiar with PISA scores, just really quickly, because I want to get to Rick and Logan? One over here, two over here. How many are familiar with the US being ranked 25th in math, 31st in science globally? How many have heard rumors and stuff like that? It comes from PISA scores. So in the year 2000, PISA launched as a way to compare countries in terms of reading and writing, math, and science. Seems really logical. It's really efficient. It's a nice way of finding a baseline. Here's two kickers. The United States has never performed well in math and science since the Kennedy administration. There's never been a point in time we've been in the top 10, ever. So we're not failing today suddenly. It's just we're suddenly using PISA scores overtly in ways we never use them. But PISA scores essentially say, can we compare countries based on these test scores? If the future of learning simply was a matter of test scores, that would be a great place to stop. The real question is, what are we trying to create when we create these learning environments for the future? In 1999, a year before, another score by the name of GEM was created, the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. It's a really interesting comparison. Both tests started within a year of each other, both comparing countries around the world, both trying to establish a baseline for something. PISA scores about test scores. GEM scores about a community, a region, a city, a nation's capacity to solve problems, to be entrepreneurial. But more importantly, the internal assumption of my ability to do that. And that's really important. GEM measures one's internal belief in one's capacity to solve problems, to innovate, to be entrepreneurial. It turns out the US scores very poorly in PISA scores, year after year after year after year after year, and quite possibly, even if we made this the full point of our educational system, we will continue to score poorly year after year after year. We score remarkably high on the GEM indicator. What's really interesting isn't to argue one versus the other, it's to think about the collision of these two. It's to think about creating 21st century learning environments, agile learning communities that don't look at either or, but instead look at that collision. That ability to have knowledge and skill side by side with that unapologetic capacity to do next. The very last thing is I want to talk about failure. We live in a day and age, if you read the New York Times a year ago, you might have seen this article about failure being the way forward for kids. There's not a business environment in this country, despite the concerns since late 2007 and 2008. There's not a business environment in this country that hasn't realized one way or another they have to make peace with failure. If they're going to go forward, if they're going to lead their market, if they're going to innovate, if they're going to launch, if they're going to be of any relevance, they just don't call it failure. They call it beta testing and prototyping. They call it venture capital. They call it incubators and innovation hubs. The rest of the world adores failure when they want to do next. So the curiosity becomes, can we see asset maps of learning resources? Can we look at that tension between the skills and the internal scrappiness to believe we can tackle anything? And ultimately, can we create environments that aren't just the business world for kiddos, but can we allow the environments for kiddos and educators and communities to really embrace not failure, but the ability to get back up, the scrappiness. Because it turns out, this is the last thing I'll say before I hand over to Rick, it turns out that if you measure test scores, GPA, SATs, 12th grader, and compare them to their first year in college, there's almost a one-to-one correlation. If all things stay equal, no divorce in the family, no broken leg, have to skip class, no fall in love and forget to go to class. If you take 12th grade scores and freshman year scores, there's almost always a one-to-one correlation controlling for the wicked unexpected. The moment you get to sophomore year, it all goes away. There's a zero correlation. It turns out that things like an ability to network, determines the ability to thrive and to succeed at the higher ed level. And that was in a traditional higher ed environment. Now we're talking about kids being able to opt out of college because they want to start their first company. So in essence, I'm curious, as we create global environments, as Logan will talk about, and we create hyper-local regional capacities to fuel next. And we think about what Lou and his team is doing with ICF and what the president and his team are doing here at Walsh. Ultimately, it's not about the answer. It's getting really, really comfortable with these questions being wicked and never going away. And when we create these environments, it's about creating the context, the fertile soil for next. So we come back to you in a little bit and ask you to take on a challenge. Ultimately, your answer, here's a little parenthetical, isn't going to be the point. It's, did we create some momentum that can't stop? Will somebody invest in something that was said today? With that said, I want to hand off to Rick, and thank you for allowing me to provoke. I think the real talent is going to show up now and talk about what has been done.
Okay, can you hear okay? Okay, great. Well, first of all, I want to give my thanks to Jackie and her team for putting this on and bringing us all together. She's done a great job, and again, thank you to Lou and ICF. That makes a great difference in terms of what you've done and how you've moved things forward. Also, Steve and I really are from Southern California, and we really did bring the weather, but I want to warn you that we are leaving again on Friday, so you may want to get ready. So they only gave me 15 minutes, and Brother Pius, can you help me? Because we got to know each other last night. I need to know when I've used up 5 minutes, I got 10 minutes left, and when I've used 10 minutes, I got 5 minutes left, and then when I have 2 minutes, because I want to stay within that 15. Okay, thank you. So there's a lot of things they didn't tell you about me. And I'm going to just put that up there. You can read that. But just know that when I came to Riverside, basically 4 years ago, every year we have had fewer dollars than the year before. So we have been doing this. In fact, we've been doing this to the degree that we've lost $100 million. We've been doing this. I've lost 25% of my management staff. And if you put it in unit dollars, we've moved from $1 to 75 cents, and if I reconcile my deficit, I'm at 65 cents, and I'm serving the same people. So you need to understand my context to understand what we're going to talk about, and just understand that that's how our world's going. The other thing that's probably relevant is as I look up Ohio, what I find is your per student funding is about $10,000 on a state average, and I realize that varies from district to district. In our case, it's less than $5,000. You need context to understand the conversation that we need to have. So part of this whole conversation is really how do you go from this position to some other position over here? And as you can see, it's not a linear relationship. And yet that's typically how we engage with people. We say, well, you know, we're going to lay out a plan, a strategic plan, we're going to have these steps, and we're going to get to where we need to go. And I think that's how we, at least in schools, have addressed much of what's going on. So as I think about this, did I say something? As I think about this, part of what I can talk to you about the what. I can talk to you about the fact that we have 18,000 devices and what we've done and all those kinds of things. But the real story behind it is the how. Because I could tell you all about the what, and you can walk out of here and you won't know a whole lot more than when you walked in. So I'm going to at least attempt to get to the how part of the conversation. So with that, there's some key drivers. First of all, at least from my perspective, this is about the learning. It is not about the devices. That's a tool, and we've always had tools. It's about the learning. And so one of my colleagues actually points out often, this is my office wall. And so when you walk into my office, there's a lot of data, and there's no data up there that talks about technology. It's only data that talks about learning. And so that's where we need to focus as we have these kinds of discussions. There was another key thing that happened in terms of how we address this, and I find this pretty unique among school districts, everybody seems to have an IT department. We too have an IT department. However, what we also have is an instructional IT department. And that has made a huge difference. Huge difference in terms of moving us forward, huge difference in terms of creating debate, because I have my traditional IT guys talking about SIPA and filtering and all those kinds of things. I have my instructional IT guy talking about, well, what about kids and learning? We have to have that tension to make this work. We also talk a lot about putting devices, and that is really ultimately, here's a bad word, control in the hands of the kids, not in the hands of the teachers. And that's not a negative about teachers, it's just that the learner is the one that needs to have the tool in their hand. Because it's about the learner, it's about the learning. And I would argue that in the how of this is really about the realignment and rethinking of the organization. And Christian talked a bit about that we have kind of a traditional view, and there's nothing wrong, nothing bad about that, but the time has come that we need to rethink our organizations. Our organizations were built typically in a very hierarchical structure, and we need to shift that because we have some better ideas at this point. Also, there's a sense of urgency. I don't know about you, but at least where I'm at, I can't wait. I got to get going. So, some key ideas. Again, it's about the learning. Within that, a lot of organizations, mine included, we start and we're really good about talking about all the can'ts. You know, we can't do this and we can't do that. We don't have enough money, at least today, because we lost $100 million, right? It's all about can't. And one of my principals, I'm going to blame it on her, in a stroke of brilliance said, we will no longer talk about can't. That just won't be part of our vocabulary. Instead, we're going to talk only about how. Let's shift the conversation. And we began to shift the conversation to the how conversation. How are we going to do that? I would also argue that as we look at that, part of that moves from the transaction of management to leadership. Everybody knows how to manage. That's like getting it done, all those kinds of things. And that's necessary. In fact, as I talk to superintendents, I say that's the stuff that gets you fired. If you don't manage it, you're going to get fired. But the other side is you won't ever get anything done unless you deal with leadership. And what's leadership? Leadership is about vision, it's about collaboration, and it's about advocacy. And those are the things that move us forward as we do this. So, my bottom line slipped to the bottom line. So as we look at this, part of what I see is we have to rethink the system itself. And learning is learning, but how does the system work? When I say system, I'm talking about the school district, about schools, about those classrooms. How do we rethink that? Because that's what's really going to make a difference. And to do that, we have to rethink assumptions. What are our assumptions going into it? Are we assuming that we got to get kids home in time to help harvest the crops? Or what's our assumption? Assumptions are important. And as we do that, at least in my organization, we begin to talk about what's that structure look like. And I think that at least in Riverside, when I got there 4 years ago, it was all about compliance. We will give you the game plan, we will tell you what to do, and it's your job to actually go get it done. That's called compliance. Which, again, as Christian mentioned, that's worked pretty well. But again, in our environment, we find that we have to move to a new notion which has to do with innovation. And if you say, well, we've already shifted to that innovation stuff, my question for you would be, and I've got lots of questions, I'll try to limit myself this morning, but I have lots of questions, and that question is, what can I get in trouble for? Can I get in trouble for not being compliant, or do I get in trouble for not being innovative? And if you don't know the answer to that, or if you think you know the answer to that, go survey some people and find out what they say they can get in trouble for. I also have to talk to you about context, because at least again in my environment, that's part of what's going on. People need to think about, well, where are we and what's going on? So this is a picture of one of my little friends that actually I ran into in Asia. And sometimes when we think about Asia, this is the picture we have. When we talk about China, we think about rice paddies and things like that, correct? So far you're with me, right? Well, here's a reality. My son took this picture recently. Actually, this is in Taiwan, in China essentially. Let me read to you what it says there because it's in Chinese. It says Costco Wholesale. Aren't you glad I interpreted? That's in Taiwan. This is in China. I think it's a different context than many of us hold in our view. We need to be thoughtful about that. Also, recently in the Charlotte Observer, Taylor Batten talked about the middle class. We're all concerned about the middle class. And what we have found is the middle class has shifted. And the blue line, whoops, it just moved up. Middle class got smaller, less affluent got larger. That could be a problem. That's driven by skills, it's driven by education, and basically across the board we have to have more. I would argue that our traditional high school diploma no longer is sufficient. You cannot support a family in America with only a high school diploma. Things are different. We need to rethink how that works and how we move forward with that. Also recently, about a month ago actually, I spent about 10 days in China, and part of my time in China was to look at their particular schools because we're all a little nervous about that. You know, what does that mean? And again, Christian mentioned the PISA report and some of those things. What does that mean? How does that work? Well, everybody has their ideas. I'm going to tell you what my observations are, and I promise there won't be many. Good news is their education program I don't think is nearly as good as ours. So we ought to feel good about that, right? Good news. Some interesting news is they've integrated music throughout everything that they do, which I find very interesting because we've tended to take music away and either separate it or eliminate it, which is interesting. Big issue for me is they've had the one-to-one policy in terms of they're going to have one child basically per family, and they've actually changed that, but there's a longitudinal effect based on that. So what that means is, and think of your own family, think of your children, in my case, grandchildren, how many children you have. What if you had one? And if you have one child, how many grandchildren do you think you're going to have? One. Now think about that one child going to school. I would suggest to you there's a very different pressure on that child than what we typically face, at least in my school district. A very different kind of focus, support, and a whole variety of other issues that come with that. That's a different assumption. They also began basically compulsory education in 2000, so we haven't even seen the true effects of compulsory education. If you start in 2000, where does that put us now? And what if we have a whole generation of students that begin to have ubiquitous education? Here's the bad news. We have a trajectory at this point that's probably looking something like this. They have a trajectory at this point that's looking something like this. Trajectory matters, and so we should be concerned about that. I think also size matters. If you look it up, we have about 300 million people in the US. So being a graphic person, I had to draw a little picture for myself. Here's China. They have 1 billion more. That is, they have 1.3 billion, 1,300,000,000. So they're quite a bit larger. So to the degree that they do well, that may influence what happens to us. But before we get comfortable, there's another place called India. They have 1.27, and they're working on the same issues. So that's context. So, because I'm a teacher, I want to ask you questions. In fact, some of you may have a quiz before we get out of here this morning. Here's part of it. I want you to read that and very quickly talk to each other, that is the person that's at your elbow there, and tell me, where is that? Where they have our rote learning and testing approach is a problem. There's no accommodation for each child's uniqueness. This is a quiz. You must talk to each other quickly and give each other a quick answer. Okay, quickly, we're done. We're done. And here's the second part of it. So based on the first part, now we're talking about a big gap today between what education needs to do and what it's actually doing. Now you know exactly where it's at, right? Because the reality is, for India to achieve the target of double-digit GDP growth, this is their game plan. And basically who they are is Z Media. Z Media happens to own Bollywood as well as a lot of other things out there. That's what they're engaging. That's their strategic plan. That's their game plan. That's their leadership. And so the question is, what is our leadership? So what have we been doing in RUSD? Again, key concepts. One of the most critical things for us is we are putting devices in the hands of students. That is critical. And when we say in the hands of students, what we mean by that is the student actually owns the device. We give them a device, and we say, guess what? This is your device. You take it wherever you go. You put whatever you put on it, kind of like you do with your phone. And the only thing we ask is in June, you come back and give it to us again at the end of the year. But it's your device. That is unlike some of our colleagues that say, you can have this device for third period, but at the end of third period, we're going to pick it back up again and take it away. We want our kids to walk out and take this everywhere they go. We want them to put music on it. We want them to put Facebook on it. We want them to put their pictures on it because that makes it theirs. And when it's theirs, they treat it differently. They learn differently. There's other things that begin to happen as a result of that. And by the way, don't underestimate the value and capacity we have with BYOD and BYON. BYOD, bring your own device, bring your own telephone. BYON, what's that? Bring your own network. We talk about broadband and insufficient broadband. That solves broadband because you all came in here this morning. How many of you logged on to the net in here, or did you just bring your own network? How are we doing, Brother Pius? Good, thank you. There are broadband options. There's digital citizenship we have to talk about because we're now citizens in a different way and we need to have responsible behavior. We talk about bullying. We also talk about cyberbullying. What's the difference? The only difference is the tool. Bullying's bullying. So we need to talk about citizenship. We also use cash servers trying to limit what our needs are because there's a lot that goes on in the school that if we just use that cash server, we can get to it. And we don't have to go outside to the net, though that still capacity is there. There's multiple options that our kids have. If you have Wi-Fi enabled devices, we can do that on campus. If we walk off campus, through Steve and his efforts, we can use Smart Riverside, which is a citywide deployment of Wi-Fi. Talking to Dr. Park in Seoul, they have Wi-Fi across Seoul, Korea. Additionally, our kids are pretty bright. They figure it out. If I go to Starbucks, I go to McDonald's, I go to the public library, I get access. So there's lots of ways to begin to solve those problems. This is a part of a video.
The workforce is digital.
Listen to
College
Ariel
is
at the end.
digital.
She's one of our students.
And we're teaching them those skills
and what
they
she
need
says and what her
so that
description
when they
is.
leave our walls, they go prepared to their next step.
You have boring old textbooks and you don't have fun apps like that, and then when you have the iPod, everything just explodes.
A number of classrooms that students are checked out with their own individual iPod Touch. In addition to that, there would be typically 6 iPads deployed in the same classroom. All of our middle schools have heavy mobile device deployment. And Ramona High School specifically is probably our greatest implementation there. It's the first all-digital high school in California, 3rd in the U.S. And each of the students has a 7-inch Android tablet. We have all their textbooks on that. We have a student dashboard that gives them key information.
So the digital dashboard has allowed me to be more in touch with my education, with my teachers, myself, my parents. It's a motivation and it's knowing where you are in your education.
Teachers no longer have to be the disseminators of knowledge. We are able to facilitate what goes on in the classroom, sending students in various places to meet their needs. It's given the students the power over their own education.
And when I'm posed with a question on homework, I'm able to figure it out myself. I go onto YouTube and I go onto the internet and I'll punch it in, and so I'm able to break down that question and analyze it for myself to get an answer and really comprehend and understand what exactly it is I'm doing. The technology itself has allowed me to challenge myself in my education on a whole nother level.
So you see, part of the problem is, and part of the change, part of the assumptions are, our assumption is that our kids are learning all day, every day, all the time. Ariel's doing that. And then we send her to school. So how does that work together? And we need to engage that. And there's more that we could talk about, but we're going to probably run short on time. So the other thing that I want to talk to you about is as we have superintendents and other people come visit our district, we've had 300 over the last 2 years. The superintendent says, well, okay, Rick, just tell me though, how do you do this? How do you do it? What's the implementation strategy? So let me share the implementation strategy. First of all, I would tell you, stop talking about it and just do it. It's not that complicated. Just do it. And I know Nike has a little thing that they talk about it, but I'm serious. I mean, these are our kids that are at risk. We got to do something about it. We just need to get it underway. We've also used as an organizational strategy, I start by creating a pilot. So I say, hey, gosh, you know, we got so many iPads or whatever the device is. We're device agnostic, actually. Does anybody want to do that? And so all of a sudden this table says, well, you know, we'd be interested in doing that. We'd give it a try. And we go, okay, here's the stuff. What else do you need? And we'll try to support you. And I don't try to burden the rest of you with the fact that these guys want to try something. They're called early adopters, by the way. And so what happens is we do it here, it's highly successful, and then guess what? I can't stop the rest of you from doing it. Because, you know, if those kids are learning so much better because of what they're doing, you all want to copy them. And you do. So we don't force people to do things. In fact, we try to motivate rather than require. And I know organizationally, when I went to superintendent school, they never talked about that. In fact, it was kind of the opposite. You're supposed to force people because that's the way we get good stuff, right? I would argue that's not at least my assumption. And I've talked to you about can't versus how. We need to change the language, change the culture about what we're doing. The other big thing is, okay, Rick, let's get serious. You have 18,000 devices. How in the heck do you deal with the IT support? Because IT support, I'm probably going to have to double the size of my IT group, right? Well, actually, I had 2 people working in instructional IT when we started. They have like a day job. They have to do all this other stuff. And I said, oh, by the way, Jay and Tracy, could you just support this other thing, these 18,000 mobile devices? And they said, sure. And they do. 2 people. And that's their side job. However, they organize an army of 13-year-olds to help us. It's not that tough. Because actually, here's a quiz, by the way. Any of you have anything that resembles this? There's one guy in the whole audience that's got one like that. Anybody else here? You have to wake up. Come on, let's go. Several of you have them. And I know that they give them away if you go to like AT&T or Verizon or Sprint or those kinds of places, right? So when you went there, did you get IT support? They assigned you your help desk analyst so that, you know, when it breaks down, your laugh, is that a laugh of recognition? Mike, you have one of those? No, they didn't give you that. Not at all. The other question is, well, what about professional development? How do you teach the teachers how to do this? That's got to be tough. One of my superintendent friends, and he's really a good friend, he goes like, man, I already got the unions filing grievances and all that stuff. What am I going to do? I said, well, stop requiring them. Why would you do that? We need just-in-time professional development. And oh, by the way, how much do you have to know to use another tool in the classroom? Yeah, probably not a lot. Here's the flip side. My colleague Jay says it this way. How long do you think we would have to train our teachers until they would know as much as the kids in the classroom about the use of this technology? So let's get over it. It's not that big a deal. Transparency. We got to be open about this. We got to talk about it. And one of the ways we do it, and Ariel talked about our student dashboard, and it's just sharing information. That's all we're doing. We're sharing credible information with our kids, with our parents, with whoever is interested in looking at it. So, I told you I'm a teacher, and I told you I have questions. So here's some of my questions. Christian, you can take notes here in case you're wondering. But before we do that, it's been attributed to Twain, though we aren't sure about that. It's not been validated at this point, but it's been said that I never let my schooling interfere with my education. Yeah, I think that's part of the question. Is it about learning, or is it about schools and structures? And we've successfully used schools and structures, but we live in a different world now than maybe before. So the questions become, what if? What if we only got paid based on the competency of the students? That is, if you take my algebra class, I only get paid as a district when the kids actually know algebra. Because I've had kids that have algebra in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, questionably whether they even understand it now, and they probably had it in 8th grade. 5 years, 5 class periods of algebra, almost a full year's of funding, and they still don't know algebra. Why are we getting paid? That doesn't make any sense. What if we focus on the outcomes and not the inputs? We are an input system, and if we do all the right inputs, we hope we'll get a great outcome. That's different than saying, let's focus only on the output side of the issue. What if all the parents and students had choice versus neighborhood placement? Does it matter where I live as to what kind of school I get to go to? And again, I think we have opportunities now that we didn't have before. I would encourage that as Walsh builds their institute here, that it's online and it gives us broader capacity, so I don't have to live in the neighborhood to get to the institute. I could do it from wherever I live and whatever I do. Open source is a big issue, and we're engaging that, I know, at a state level and a national level. You know, what is a textbook? And by the way, those of you school people, how many algebra books have you bought over the years, and since when did they change algebra? Is it different? I don't think so. A textbook's just a collection of information, but really when we look at the internet and we look at the options that are there, we look at the open source that's there, that's probably where our conversation needs to be. And why would we ever buy another textbook again, would be my argument. And for those university folks, hate to tell you that, but the same kind of thing. I think it's the same question that we need to look at. So when we look at all this, and again, I'm going to go back to my colleagues. When they visit me, they say, well, Rick, what's the big idea? What actually happens relative to kids when we do this? Well, I'd say there's a couple things. When I give kids devices, what I get is I get extended learning time. Ariel talks about it. Her dad talks about it. Her dad says, we're going to grandma's, and Ariel's in the back seat. She whips out her device, and she's looking at the device. She may be looking at Facebook, I get that. She may be listening to tunes, I get that. But she also, we find, may be doing her homework. She may be looking at the embedded video in the digital text, etc. So it extends the learning time, and that's powerful and that's important. Also, I get greater engagement. Can you engage with your device and do something else at the same time? I think not. In fact, that's why we have a lot of conversation and laws about not texting and driving, because we find when you're texting and driving, you're really not driving, you're just texting, right? It's called engagement. What's the one thing, what's the holy grail that we go after in schools? It's engagement. When people are engaged, good things happen in terms of learning. So that's a second thing that I get out of it, and I think that's powerful. Also, as I do that, I begin to build choice, which another way to say choice is personalization, because what your particular needs are in terms of a learner might be different than what your particular needs are as another learner. What do you want to learn? How do you want to learn it? Where do you want to learn? Where are you going with that? So personalization is important. And bottom line, I get improved performance. But going back to one of Christian's earlier points, the other question is, does the test have to do with performance, or is performance sometimes outside of the test? We only test essentially reading and mathematics. Language arts and mathematics. Is there anything else in the world going on? And by the way, I would say that my website in references, lots of times people ask me, where can I find out more about whatever? There's just a bunch of stuff parked up there. There's no great order to it. Good luck, but at least it's there. Logan.